Thank you. Thank you. And everyone can hear me okay and see my screen okay? Yes, okay. I just wanted to thank Peter and the Brentwood Public Library for inviting me. And thank you for taking time out of your day. I know you have a lot of options, like Southwest says, and I'm glad you chose this one for this afternoon. And I'm going to get started. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. So the Big Duck is a 20 feet tall by 30 feet wide ferro concrete building in the shape of a Peking duck. It was first conceived by duck farmer Martin Maurer in 1931 as a retail shop for duck eggs and poultry, and was initially located in the Upper Mill section of Riverhead, Long Island. As conceived, it was both functional and symbolic. And it was an actual location for purchasing duck products, as well as a locally iconic landmark that heralded the rise and strength of Long Island's burgeoning duck farming industry. But since that time, the Big Duck's function has shifted dramatically. While you can no longer buy duck products inside the structure, you can instead purchase duck memorabilia and learn about the history of Long Island duck farming. Despite those changes, the notoriety of the Big Duck endures. It is a surprisingly frequent source of discussion in pop culture. Indeed, the Big Duck has found its way into modern comedy. Most recently, during a show at Old Westbury, when British comedian John Oliver fell to the stage laughing when he Googled to find out about Long Island, and the results listed the Big Duck at the top. It has been a subject of popular and artistic treatment even further back, with cartoons by Saul Steinberg on the cover of the New Yorker magazine, comic strips, and countless artworks. Despite its enduring popularity, it has narrowly escaped destruction several times, due no part to the strong following and support it receives from organizations such as the Friends of the Big Duck and the strength of certain traditions, such as the annual holiday duck lighting. I think and I hope that the Big Duck is here to stay and has found its permanent home. But let's dig a little deeper into the Big Duck. Why build a building in the shape of a duck? What does the Big Duck symbolize today? Most people recognize the duck as a prime example of American roadside architecture, but they don't truly know the history behind it, as well as the history of duck farming on Long Island. In my book, The Big Duck in Eastern Long Island's Duck Farming Industry, after nearly 2 years of interviewing duck farmers and their families, as well as combing through institutions' photography collections, I discuss the history of the Big Duck in the context of the Long Island duck farming industry through almost 200 photographs, some of which I will share with you today. So first, I'm going to go over the history of the duck farming industry on Long Island. And everyone can hear the pace is okay? Yep, okay, great. So most white tablecloth dining establishments have featured Long Island duckling on the menu. The Peking duck was chosen for its quick birth to slaughter wait time, and it has been linked to the Eastern Long Island region, despite not being native to the area. The multi-million-dollar Long Island duck industry was hatched from 1 drake and 3 ducks, which were brought over to New York from China in 1873. The island's sandy terrain, waterfront property, temperate climate, and proximity to New York City markets made it an optimal environment in which to breed and raise ducks. After much experimentation with the breed, duck farms crept up all along the shorelines of Long Island, though the greatest concentration was between Eastport and Riverhead, and the duck population exploded. And so this is a 1916 map of Eastport, and all of these are farms along the Seatuck Creek. So like Tuttle, these were all duck farms at one point. Initially, raising ducks was labor intensive and required many human hands. Ann Dempkins, whose parents purchased a duck farm in 1921, stated, quote, "When my parents started, my mother carried pails of feed, she carried pails of water, she picked duck feathers, she did whatever had to be done. I try to help as much as I can. It's a family business," end quote. Duck farmers would raise their own breeding stock and hatch their own eggs. Peking ducks stood out amongst other breeds available, like Muscovy, because the Peking were good breeders, usually laying about 150 eggs a year. 4 weeks were needed to hatch an egg, and the first were hatched with setting hens until kerosene incubators were introduced. The ducklings would be stored in brooder houses and fed a homemade fattening mixture. Farmers devised a track system with trains that would bring the feed out to the ducklings. As you can see here, this is an example of that track with where they would wheel the feed out on wagons and then distribute it. At about 6 weeks, the ducklings were sent to the waterfront until the killing day came at about 10 to 12 weeks. And so they would be hung up in a stockade, and the duck farmer would cut them at the vein, the jugular vein, and they would bleed out into the trough underneath. After slaughter on site, they were washed and carried to the picking room. Almost all parts of a duck were incorporated into food or other products. Mostly females would pluck around 50 to 100 ducks per day, and then the feathers would be sold for pillows, sleeping bags, and jackets. And there was a pillow factory in Brooklyn that they sent a lot of feathers to. One farm worker once remarked, quote, "They sold everything but the quack," end quote. The ducks were packed in vats of ice and sent to restaurants and New York City markets. So here's Gus Wilson for Swiftstream Farms in Center Mauritius. Handsome fellow. For instance, in 1900, John Westerhoff opened the restaurant John Duck at the Eastport Inn. It was famous for its duck dinners and signature dish of duck with Bing cherries and coleslaw. And celebrities would flock, forgive the pun, to have duck dinners here. So I believe Elizabeth Taylor, Edward Burton, is that her husband? I might be getting the first name wrong. But they dined at the Eastport Inn. So modern innovations were gradually introduced to the duck farming business, such as electric incubators, pre-made food pellets, and the Long Island Duck Growers Cooperative, founded in 1921. Instead of setting hens, farmers relied on hot water incubators until the first electric incubator was introduced on Long Island in 1928. The electric incubators cut down on the risk of fire and maintained a stable temperature during the hatching period, turning the eggs 3 times a day to prevent the embryos from sticking to the shells. In this photograph shown here in 1938, H.F. Corwin of Crescent Duck Farm checks on eggs in his new incubator unit in a state-of-the-art building outfitted with air conditioning, artificial lighting, and germicidal lamps to prevent the spread of airborne bacteria. From the 1920s to the 1950s, Long Island Duck Farms enjoyed the height of its business. It was during this time that the big duck was first erected by duck grower Martin Maurer on the former land of the Pugsley Farm in Upper Mills Riverhead in 1931. Maurer, shown here, was born in 1883 in New Jersey to German immigrants. In 1931, in the throes of the Great Depression, Maurer and his wife Jewel went on a cross-country trip to Los Angeles, and after visiting a coffee shop in the shape of a percolator, he had the brilliant idea to build a building in the shape of a duck to sell duck broilers and duck eggs on a farm that he managed on West Main Street, Route 25. Maurer enlisted the help of a local architect, George Reeve, and a theater set designer, William Collins, um, who supposedly designed sets for Broadway. So that makes a little bit more sense. And with his assistance of his brother, they constructed the wooden framework and covered it with a wire mesh. The masons, Smith and Yeager, were hired to do plaster work and added 4 coats of cement. When the head was finished, someone got the idea to include Ford Model T taillights that lit up red at night for the duck's eyes. And those are still working. Most likely it was the theater set designer who had that idea. The Big Duck was completed in June 1931 and unsurprisingly did not go unnoticed. The same month, an article in the Riverhead News stated, quote, "Motorists passing through Riverhead now have something else to remember us by. It's the Big Duck on the Maurer Ranch in Upper Mills. It's the biggest duck ever raised anywhere in the world." The Big Duck soon became a landmark in relation to big name stores in town. So this is a King Cullen advertisement. And look at these prices. But you can see that underneath it says "Near the Big Duck." Maurer capitalized on all the attention gathered by his new building and marketed it fiercely. He consistently ran newspaper articles announcing its opening every March, touting its modern and sanitary facilities, and printed brochures with recipes for duck dinners. It was featured in an Atlas cement calendar. It was featured in Popular Mechanics magazine in 1932 and was used as a mascot for Drake's Cakes Bakery for the World's Fair in 1939. Fearful that someone would steal his idea of a duck-shaped building, Maurer immediately applied for a trademark for the duck in August 1931. And so this is the application for the trademark. Maurer's plan worked, and he grew successful enough that he could purchase his own farm on Route 24 in Flanders in 1936. And so he took the Big Duck with him. And so he moved the Big Duck from Upper Mills to Route 24. Let's see. And he remained there for 16 years until retiring to Florida in 1952. So the next family to own the Big Duck was the Desson family, whose son I've been in contact with and who is a great source for my book. So the Desson family bought the farm from Martin Maurer in 1951 and owned it for 20 years. Mrs. Desson, shown here, worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., 84 hours a week from the third Friday in March to the day before Thanksgiving. Through the years, she waited on Hattie Yastrzemski, who is the Red Sox's Carl Yastrzemski's mother, journalist Alistair Cook, and food critic Craig Claiborne. And this is the interior of the Big Duck in 1962. And in this photograph, the black air hoses in the foreground, shown here, would buzz in the neighboring farmhouse when a car drove over them to alert Mrs. Desson that the customers were there. So she would constantly go back and forth from the farmhouse to help customers in the Big Duck. Like the Maurers, the family often enjoyed proudly posing in front of the shop to take pictures. And this is the Desson's son and their daughter and their cousins in front of the Big Duck in 1953. The Dessons felt a great sense of pride in owning the duck, and they maintained it meticulously. At first, there were white rocks on the border between the grass and the drive, but Leonard Desson Sr. eventually replaced it with a white concrete edge in 1958, which helped me with a lot of my photo dating, because I would see all these pictures of the Big Duck, and if I saw the concrete curb, I would know that the photograph was dated after 1958. The border was also edged with red and white petunias every year. Desson also poured a concrete sidewalk for Mrs. Desson to walk in between the farmhouse and the Big Duck, but it was too hard on her knees, so she walked on the grass. Under the Dessons' ownership, every 5 years, the duck was hand wire cleaned and then professionally repainted. So they really kept it up. They were he said his father was very German, very set in his ways. Next, Mario and Jean Colombo purchased the Big Duck and Big Duck Ranch from the Dessons in 1971. Mario came from a cooking background and worked as a cook at the Ambassador Inn. They raised mostly chickens with a few turkeys, sheep, Muscovy ducks, and pigs, and continued to operate the Big Duck as a shop where they sold rotisserie chicken. They made the building once known as the tool shed into an antique shop. They also transformed the building known as the Manure House into a sandwich shop. So I don't know if their customers knew that it used to be a manure house. They also built a gingerbread house that sold cookies. The Colombos had 2 children, Dean and Denise. And here they are posing in front of the Big Duck on Easter Sunday. These photographs are photos taken at the same location over regular intervals of time, capture that many of the owners of the Big Duck were first-generation American farmers who worked long hours and took great pride in owning the Big Duck. And the Colombos actually still live out east, so they also lent me many photographs for my book. So from the 1920s to the 1950s, duck farms on Long Island enjoyed the height of their business. Throughout the 1950s, Long Island produced about 6 to 8 million ducks annually, and the number of farms grew to 90 operating simultaneously. The Big Duck became a popular postcard subject of those who visited Long Island. Many visitors were surprised by the amount of ducks and duck farms seen on the East End. Due to its highly unusual shape and prominence on Route 24 in Flanders, that was once the main thoroughfare out to the Hamptons. So the Big Duck also became a landmark from which travelers gauged the arrival time to their destination. Motorists, especially children, would strain to see the Big Duck out their car windows, as it would help answer the age-old question, are we there yet? However, not everyone loved the Big Duck. In 1964, architectural critic Peter Blake included it in his book that he called God's Junkyard, The Planned Deterioration of America's Landscape. Blake called this, quote, a deliberate attack upon those who have befouled a large portion of this country for private gain and are engaged in befouling the rest. Blake called out those who ruined the landscape through the billboard industry and said that these people had no ties to the landscape or town in which they lived in creating these eyesores. He inserted the Big Duck into the chapter on landscape next to images of families feeding ducks in their natural habitat. So this is how it appeared in the book. The Big Duck was most famously canonized in 1972 by postmodern architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in their book Learning from Las Vegas. They used the term, quote, duck architecture to classify any building that was a symbol that took the shape of its function. And so they would pass the duck back and forth on their way to the Hamptons, and they would see it. And so they inserted it into their book. And they said that it was, quote, where architectural systems of space, structure, and program are submerged and distorted by a symbolic form. And so they included this diagram of a duck, so a building that takes the shape of its function, versus a decorated shed that is just a building with a shaped sign advertising its function. Let's see. So after that, any building that took the shape of its function is now called a duck, no matter the shape. And this is still true today. So these are examples of other architectural ducks. So we have the Big Shoe that sold leather. the Langeberger Basket Company. This is their headquarters. This was a photo developing lab in Los Angeles, and then a Coney Island hot dog stand. But these are all known as ducks, which are named after the big duck on Long Island. Okay. So numerous examples of duck architecture are also posted inside the Big Duck gift shop. Unfortunately, or fortunately in some people's eyes, by the mid-1960s, duck farms on Long Island dwindled from what was once 100 to 48 due to overproduction. In the 60s and 70s, stricter New York State environmental regulations were introduced, specifically focusing on water pollution in the South Shore bays and inlets. Suffolk County Executive H. Lee Dennison, who has a building named after him in Hauppauge, he vowed to make Suffolk County, quote, a duckless county. Farmers were forced to invest in wastewater treatment plants, moving their ducks inside. Faced with property taxes, sky-high property taxes, and higher costs of grain and labor, rather than invest in their farms, many of them chose to sell their real estate and move their farms to the Midwest and Pennsylvania. In 1968, there were 48 duck farms remaining, and by 2009, the number decreased to 3. Chester Massey and Sons was the longtime second place holdout. They closed their doors in 2015, making Crescent Duck Farm in Aquabog the last duck farm left on Long Island. President Doug Corwin credits their longevity with their willingness to evolve and their large investments in wastewater treatment and updated facilities. And so this is an aerial view of Crescent Duck, and you can see that Doug Corwin, he updated his facilities for to clean the water and the waste. Yes. Okay. The gradual decline in the number of duck farms also threatened the Big Duck itself. The Colombos sold the property in 1982 to Kia and Porin Eshki, a couple who had emigrated to the US from Iran in 1962. Kia is an accomplished sculptor and painter, and his wife hoped to transform the land into an artist's residency or an artist commune. However, they were never able to get the permits for their 13 condo units, and the fate of the Big Duck became unclear. The farm sat unused and fell into disrepair until 1987, and the Eshkis sold the land to developers in Hong Kong. The same year, at the urging of politicians, including J. Lance Malamo and Jerry Kessler from the Friends for Long Island's Heritage, they asked the Eshkis to donate the Big Duck to Suffolk County to save it from demolition on the condition that it be moved from the property on Route 24 in Flanders. So in 1988, the Big Duck was moved a few miles southeast to the 1,000-acre Sears Bellow County Park. It was moved whole by placing it on flatbed rails. So the rails were attached to a truck, and the Big Duck was moved 4 miles on Route 24 to Sears Bellow County Park. And onlookers came to watch the fanfare, and volunteers escorted the Big Duck to make sure that it cleared telephone wires and tree branches. And so here are some photographs from the moving. I heard there was traffic backed up for hours to watch the Big Duck move down the road. Once at Sears Bellows, the Big Duck was given a new foundation and restored. It remained there for 19 years, reopening as a gift shop and East End Welcome Center, recognizing the generosity of the Eshkis' gift and decision to donate the Big Duck to Suffolk County. Once owned by the county, it was transformed into a gift shop selling duck merchandise, duck-themed merchandise. So this is what it looks like today, the interior. So they no longer sell ducks, but they sell duck souvenirs. And motorists passing by would tune to radio station 88.3 to hear a pre-taped message by supermodel Christy Brinkley as the voice of the Big Duck. who used to say things such as, quote, "You admit I have a good shape," and "Hey, I don't look that old, do I?" in order to raise money for the interior renovations. With all the links to the past and duck farming challenge, there was a bid by the president of the Long Island Aviation Association to move the big duck to MacArthur Airport, believe it or not, as well as proposals to make it a crown jewel in a museum of roadside architecture. But these were met with lack of funding due to the recession in 1993. The big duck stood at the entrance of Sears-Bellow County Park from 1988 to 2007. During this time, the site of Maurer's Big Duck Ranch, the second location, it remained undeveloped, and the town of Southampton purchased it in 2001, and there was big calls for it to be returned to its original spot in Flanders, or its second location in Flanders. So in 2007, the Big Duck returned to its previous location on Route 24, where it continues to operate as a gift shop and welcome center. And this is what it looks like today. And the surrounding buildings were restored, and a multimedia exhibition of Long Island duck farming history, curated by David Wilcox and Lisa Dabrowski, was installed in the barn right here in the center. Today, the Big Duck is now on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's considered to be Suffolk County's most popular historic site. It receives approximately 10,000 visitors a year, not including the countless numbers who pass by it and stop to take a selfie or photograph in front of the Big Duck. And this is a sampling of them that I found. Currently, the photo sharing site Instagram has over 10,000 posts with the Big Duck hashtag, and a large majority of them selfies that capture the whimsy and wonder associated with the duck, or what architectural theorist James Wines proposed as the DDT, or the Duck Design Theory, claiming that buildings such as the Big Duck and other examples of duck architecture introduce play, fantasy, and whimsy into our otherwise humdrum everyday experiences. And judging by these photographs, I think that theory rings true. And you can see that Christy Brinkley returned to see the Big Duck. Let's see. The Friends of the Big Duck is a nonprofit volunteer organization that was founded in 2008, and it sponsors popular programs involving the famous landmarks such as the Easter egg hunt and the rubber ducky race. And then Suffolk County sponsors the annual holiday duck lighting ceremony every Wednesday after Thanksgiving to kick off the season with duck carolers and duck Christmas carols. So it's the same day that Rockefeller Center lights the big tree on Long Island, we light the Big Duck. Crescent Duck Farm is still alive and was doing pretty well until the COVID pandemic, with fifth generation farmers working. A Newsday article from last year listed their revenue at $13 million, producing about 1 million ducks a year, or 4% of the nation's duck supply, with plans to build a new hatchery. Although recently they've announced layoffs because of the pandemic, unfortunately. Many abandoned duck farms remain on Long Island. However, Suffolk County's Department of Planning has been hard at work testing the nitrogen levels of the land and revitalizing and cleaning the water of former duck farms for recreational use and nature preserves. For instance, there's the Robinson Duck Farm Dog Park on the former site of the Robinson Duck Farm in South Haven that opened in 2009. Many other reminders of duck farming on Long Island still persist, from the Long Island Ducks baseball team, Duck Walk Vineyards, and small family-run poultry farms, particularly on the North Fork. So like Idaho potatoes and Maine lobster, duck remains synonymous with Long Island. Indeed, one can argue it's the greatest food association that exists to the region. And shown here is a menu at the Modern Snack Bar. They're still selling roast Long Island duckling. And then this is a Exxon Mobil old gas pamphlet that had the recreational sites of Long Island. And you can see here, they've pointed out Long Island duckling. So despite H. Lee Denison's promise to make Suffolk a duckless county, with the help of a devoted following and devoted farmers, and perhaps, somewhat ironically, protection of regulations that preserve its existence, the big duck and Long Island duck farming will continue to persist on menus and in the minds of people everywhere, hopefully. And so this concludes my lecture on Long Island duck farming.